Good morning, everyone. My name is Audrena Redmond. I am a Director of Programs for Anti-Racism and Social Justice Work with the California Faculty Association, which is a labor union that represents the professors who teach in the Cal State system. I also am co-founder of the Black Lives Matter Long Beach chapter. So happy to be here with you and bringing in what I know from my work in both of those capacities. So I want to thank you. I want to start by thanking you all for your good work and the work that you're doing. It's very important. And to let you know how present you are in this moment after George Floyd's murder and after all the other murders that we see. We really have the attention of everybody right now in the interest of many to address violence in all of its forms, right? Particularly in my case, I'm most interested in addressing what we call state-sanctioned violence. That is the kind of violence that comes to us from government forces, basically, and from racism and from systemic racism. So let's jump into this. So I don't know how many people I may have met before. I'm going to share my screen. I don't have the ability to share screen just yet.
Hold on one second. You're the co-host.
It says.
Oh, wait, no, that's somebody else. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, host disabled. Yeah.
That was someone else.
Okay. So also, I'm not in my office at home, and so I only have one screen, and so we'll see how this works with what I can see, what you can see, because I want to probably try to sneak and see some notes every now and then, but let me see. I would probably pop on and do that places. Okay, do I have the ability now? Yes. Okay, so I will not be seeing your lovely faces because I can't see you and do this PowerPoint too. So do that. Give me 1 second. I thought I was going to come on here and have a few minutes to listen to you. So you all see my screen? Should I admit someone? Somebody else will take care of that.
No,
we have it. No worries. Thank you.
Okay. Do you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. All right. So here's a little. So I'm going to be talking about doing a U.S. labor history timeline with you and adding into it important pieces of Black history and Black organizing and Black activism. And I think this is important too, because, a #1 deterrent to violence in our communities is employment, gainful employment, and the kind of employment where you can pay your bills, maybe think about taking a trip, make sure your kids have what they need, you're eating, that sort of thing. And so American workers have certainly been fighting for years in this country to make sure that there are, that folks have what they need and that they can live a full life. So, in terms of labor unions, which are people being organizing together for their shared interests, economic interests. Between 1700 and close to 1914, most people were organized by their trade, by their craft, right? So let's say then ancient crafts might be if you were a potter, like you made pottery, if you were a blacksmith, if you were a mechanic of some sort of farming tool, if you were a basket weaver, if you were a sewer, those were considered crafts. If you were a ship maker, right, those were considered skilled crafts. But it also was a period of a great deal of suppression, of government suppression of labor and labor unions because of the rising industrialization. So folk might recall learning in school about the industrialization in the United States, where which is something that upheld and supported slavery in this country, because all the cotton that was grown in the South was shipped north, and it was then spun into fabric and made into clothes and shipped to Europe for that same purpose. And so if we want to think about labor suppression, surely the enslaved folk in this country were suppressed. But that, and there was a shift that happened after the Civil War with Reconstruction. And what happened was that poor white folks now were competing directly with these newly freed enslaved folk for work. And I'm saying enslaved on purpose, because to call someone a slave would mean that you are born and is inherited, and it's nothing you can do about that. And that's not the case. The case is that folks were enslaved against their will. And so the enslaved the formerly enslaved were now out and looking for work, and side by side, and in many ways equal, and at the same, if not greater skill level as the poor white folks. And so they started organizing labor unions beyond just the craft organizing. And when I say that, that means no matter where they were organizing together for employment, for working conditions. And so starting around 1886, there were a series of strikes and riots, workers rioting for better pay. And the employers, were pretty heavy-handed and put them down pretty hard with teams of folks that attacked them, abused them, had folks arrested, thrown in jail, killed, all of that. And why does this sounds like a lot, but when you're trying to protect your money, that is what industry does a lot. Doesn't want to be accountable necessarily. But people kept pushing. And people were pushing for what we take for granted now, which is standard, an 8-hour workday, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for leisure or relaxing, or whatever you choose to do with that time. And that labor organizing was indeed successful, mostly for white folks, because, as you know, what happened then was that Black folks were underemployed and unemployed, and then penalized for existing. And so we had something called the penal colonies, which came about because of Jim Crow laws, or something that was called PIG laws, P-I-G laws, which made it possible to arrest a Black person because you were loitering, or because you were unemployed, or because you were somewhere that someone didn't think you were supposed to be, for anything. And those folks were then put to work on the chain gang. I know we've all heard of that. They were put to work on the chain gang. And so that led to a push for something different. It took a little while for Black folks to get organized because in that period, now we went to war. We had World War I. And what happened in World War I? Our ancestors went overseas. Our ancestors got out of this country and learned some things, learned that they were not treated the same way in Europe as they were treated here, learned new ideologies, learned about Marxism and socialism and those forms of things, and then came back home with expectations to be treated better after having been overseas and been in war and seen that and died and been mistreated in the military, because the military was segregated, right? And so 1925, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was formed by A. Philip Randolph. And that was really transformational because they just like we always do when we get involved in something, turned it all upside down on its head and pointed folks in a new direction. And that is because it was the first union of Black men and women, and who then pushed and had a first collective bargaining agreement with the railroad agency, and with no help from the other unions, from the other organized workers, precisely because of discrimination, and precisely because they weren't accepted into those unions. But after they were able to successfully organize, then they were invited into and became part of, you all have probably heard of the American Federation of Labor. And so there was a series of events after that that helped to really open the door to labor to Black folks. So here's some pictures from the sleeping car porters, them in their uniforms, and their union card, a image of preparing for a march and its activism. And this right here, this is A. Philip Randolph at a march. And the other reason why these folks were important is because it's with the skills that folks gain from labor organizing, and the arguments that they were making in their labor organizing were really transformational, not just for their members, but for our Black communities. And so A. Philip was a great organizer and helped to organize the 1963 March on Washington. And in fact, was in that conversation along with Dr. King. It's not just talking about civil rights, but they were talking about folks need work. Folk need work. The perceptions of our community, of Black folks, were such that were undeserving of us, and that what was needed was fair treatment. What was needed was employment. What was needed was housing. What was needed is education. All of the things that help communities to thrive. And when those things aren't there, their violence ensues. I know that you all have all seen that, or I would think that plenty of studies that show with unemployment, domestic violence goes up. With unemployment, the activity in illegal activities go up in our communities, because that's what there is. That's what there is. And I think if folks remember South LA, South LA used to have the auto industry, right? South LA their cars were being built there, and tires were being built there, and all sorts of jobs that paid good living wages so that folks could buy houses and have cars. Those are the kind of things that labor unions fought for, not just for their members, but making the arguments for the broader community, because that's where we all live. We live in the broader community. And speaking of the auto industry, at one point, Detroit had the highest the largest number of Black middle class folks because of the auto industry. I think at one point, Dodge had 70% of its employees working at Dodge were African-American. At Chevy, over 50% of its employees were African-Americans. And folks were there, and still they needed to be organizing. And so we had the League of Revolutionary Black Workers formed, and the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement formed, or also known as DRUM. And they had to form because not only were they facing obstacles in just being Black in America. They were very much facing obstacles from their own labor union, from that tool that provided them the skills and the resources to lobby legislators to push for laws and policies that would help communities, that would keep communities employed, that would make sure that school funding is there. And actually, one of the best ways to make sure that your school is funded is to make sure that there are local taxes. And how do you get local taxes? You get local taxes because people can afford to buy their phones, because people can afford to shop. And that's how you get local taxes. But if folks are unemployed, then those things are impossible, and the frustration sets in and other things. These folks here talk about lessons and talk about giving direction. I don't know what you all know, but you know, the auto industry in America shifted at some point, and folks weren't buying American cars so much as they were buying cars from Japan. You know, we had Toyota into the market and Nissan into the market, which put a lot of pressure on the American auto industry. And so the Black workers really led a lot of organizing and pushback to try and keep folks employed. And as we know in Detroit, over time, you know, that it shifted. The auto industry changed. It automated. And Detroit has been really fighting and struggling back. But there is a lot of really great stuff happening in Detroit in terms of people addressing needs of community and pushing back and fighting for and being really ingenious and creative in helping themselves to survive. So that's the labor was start to see a decline. And that decline came when Ronald Reagan was president, when he was our very own Ronald Reagan, because he was from California. He decimated the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, and they went out of, they no longer exist. They were decertified in 1981. And then the UPS strike in 1997, which would put 180,000 folks out of work. That's a lot of people. And this era here is really important because what was happening in our Black communities? What was happening was the war on drugs was happening. What was happening was the crack epidemic. What was happening was mass incarceration. Our folks were going to jail in crazy numbers, and our communities were falling apart, in part because no good jobs. The jobs had left. And, you know, there's a little more to it, but the jobs had left. The infrastructure was allowed to fall. And the new industry, in a way, was indeed mass incarceration. It was imprisonment of our folks. There was a huge increase in the number of prisons built, right? And some folks will say, well, construction jobs are good because that, that's employment. The only issue there is that Black folks don't necessarily get those construction jobs. Black folks don't necessarily benefit from those structures unless we are consciously organizing and being a part of making sure that our voices are there. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But in this era of decline, we also saw defunding of education. We see the increased organizing, which is very much where we are now, an increase in organizing and coordination between labor unions and social justice movements. Now, what y'all are doing there are for sure some labor unions that are involved and interested in that because they see themselves as broader as than just their own labor self-interest. They see themselves as part of the broader community. So unions like the Service Employees International Union is very much involved in making sure and trying to help and address issues in our communities, education, police violence, et cetera, et cetera. Unions like the one I work for are very much involved in the same thing, precisely because not only do our folks live in these communities, but our students come from these communities. And we see and understand and deal and interact with folks and can see the traumas. And quite frankly, sometimes, students will come and they have issues that as faculty we're not equipped to deal with. We need to have them go to the counseling services and a lot of times that has to do with violence and issues happening at home. And yeah. And so I'm going to stop there. If there's anybody has a question or a comment before I move on. Okay. So this is a little funny. Education is a valuable tool. It's a very valuable tool. If you don't have the education, then you are subject to believe whatever anyone tells you. As my father, well, my dad used to say a lot of things, but he says, I don't know if y'all have heard, my father used to call sometimes to say, oh, that's an educated fool. That's because you think you know something, but if you don't dig down and ask the questions, why does this exist? Why is this happening? Why does my community look like this? How come there are no jobs over here? Why do we have, why do folks get treated the way that they do? And a lot of that is because of public policy. It's public policy. So an example of how unions are involved in changing our communities, in shaping our communities, in providing resources to our community, making sure folks have work that can sustain them. I hope that some of you, I can't see anybody, are familiar with the fight for 15. Oh, I realized that this is all, I just realized this is all in yours too. That the fight for 15, are people familiar with the fight for 15? Can't see, I can't, okay, yeah. And so that was the fight for 15, that was begun in 2012. And Obama was our president then. And still it was seen as a great time and an opportunity to raise the bar for unemployment. You all know how expensive it is to live here, and minimum wage is just, it does not cut it. It is not enough. Hardly anyone can pay rent and eat just on minimum wage, depending on, it's very difficult. And so labor, particularly the Service Employees International Union, really helped to organize and took up the fight for this. And it started in New York, largely with Black workers who were working at fast food restaurants. And New York is slightly more expensive to live than California is. And this place is really expensive to live. But they took up this fight and they've had a lot of success. They have had a lot of success. The minimum wage was raised here in California. There's lots of conversation. The minimum wage was raised at the federal level, and still we're pushing to raise it some more, because the honest truth is that what we really need is $22 an hour. If you adjust for inflation from the last time the minimum wage was raised, we really need $22 an hour. $15 an hour doesn't cut it. I have, there's lots of folks say, oh, well, those are high school students. That's all they need. And I don't know about you, but I know people who work in fast food restaurants who are grown. They have parents in their house. They have children in their house, and they're working 2 they're working 2 minimum wage jobs in some fast food restaurant, and then using the little car they have to do Postmates or Grubhub or whatever it is. And I'm sure plenty of you know those people too. And so when folks get stressed out, it can lead to all kinds of things, but it's the organizing that brings results. It's the organizing and the community building that empowers people. It informs people. It helps people to see results, to get results that are transformative for themselves and their families. So you can see this, that there are who's affected by low wages. It is Black and Hispanic workers who would benefit most from an increase in the minimum wage. And unfortunately, I saw this graphic and I like the graphic, but unfortunately, if I'm not mistaken, the Raise the Wage Act of 2021, which was proposed by the Biden administration, did not make it out of the Senate when they worked on the last COVID. What is that? I forget what it's called, the infusion of COVID monies, where we all got the little extra bump of COVID dollars. But it's still.
Was it the stimulus?
Yes,
the stimulus. Okay.
Yes, thank you. I couldn't think of the word. But you can see here that once again, this is a graph where Black folks are at the top, and more specifically, Black women, because it is Black women and Black children are most affected by unemployment issues. Black women and Black children are most affected by not having enough wage, the wage not being high enough. Black women and Black children are most affected by the cost of living, by the cost of housing. And Black women and Black children are also disproportionately subjected to household violence, to domestic violence, which for police actually is a majority of calls have to do with domestic violence. And domestic violence is related to a lot of things, but it is really affected with employment issues, with
why is it?
Stress. It's stress, lack of opportunities, and honestly, you could relate it to a lot of things, right? There's individual, but in the Black community, it is underemployment. It is the effects of the generational effects of racism. It is, and that comes in the forms of a scarcity mentality. That comes in the form of what I see around me, and the opportunity around me is just what I see around me and the opportunities around me. It's living in under-resourced environments, and environments where people talk about you and the whole policies around you are coming from the negative. So, the terms when folks say underserved, or that term really bothers me, underserved or underrepresented. Those are negative terms. And so public policy always addresses our communities then from that negative standpoint. And too often, public policy doesn't necessarily listen to the folks from the community. They do something there's a quote I love from South Africa, which is, "Nothing about us without us is for us." right? So nothing about us without us is for us. And what I love about what y'all are doing is you're digging down and you are about it. You're about it. You're in the conversation. You're in the conversation to do the work to end the violence in our communities. And what I'm encouraging you is that part of ending that violence in the community is, yes, it's digging down in there and it's talking to folks and getting to know folks and relating to folks and really understanding what people need. But I'm going to give you an example. So my Black Lives Matter chapter, a few years back, we had our large community event, and we were all set and ready to talk about the police murders in Long Beach, and to talk about how the school system treating our kids, particularly the kids that live on the west side and the north end of the city, and how those schools are differently funded. And folks were like, oh, yeah, that's really nice information. But what we want is this Ralph's to come back into the neighborhood. What we want some jobs right here in the neighborhood. So we don't have to go so far. We need some work here. And we were rocked back because we had spent all that time thinking we knew, but we made a fatal mistake. And that mistake was we were starting where we were rather than starting where the community was. And so if a concern of the community is violence, then how are we addressing that violence? How do we help to remedy that violence? And one way for sure, study after study has shown that one way for sure is to make sure that people are employed. And more specifically, which is interesting, is to make sure that women are employed. Make sure that women are employed. Again, we're talking about domestic violence. Again, we're talking about the fact that for the Black community, the majority of our households are led by Black women. And so Black women need employment. And Black men for sure need employment, and we need gainful employment. So where are some opportunities for gainful employment in Los Angeles? One of those places here is in all of the railroad development, the expansion and the development of LA Metro. I have here an image from the Los Angeles Black Workers Center. If you don't know who they are, I would suggest that you look them up and follow what they do, because they're really doing excellent work to push and make sure that Black folks have employment in places where we are not traditionally there. We're there, but not in great numbers. And that is in the construction industry, in construction of all of this infrastructure development that's happening, running through Crenshaw, for example, the rail line, or the Expo line, which is not so new anymore, but when it was being built, making sure that Black workers were there, making sure that, and here I'm going to cheat because I want to read my notes for you. I can get them, probably I can't. There we go. All right. So the LA Black Workers Center was a project of the UCLA Labor Center, and they started in 2009. And they took a focus at their master. It took a 5-year focus at the Master Project Labor Agreement, which invested $12 billion in transit and other infrastructure projects. And they were successful. And they led a raise the wage, an anti-wage theft campaign, which they were also successful. And they're making the arguments about communities can't thrive if people aren't working. People need to work. And so then we use the arms of government, our county, the county government, the city government, the state government, the federal government, to make sure that policies are in place and to fight discrimination, to make sure that Black folks get jobs, to make sure that Black folks get jobs. Yeah. Yeah. That's what I wanted to say. Has anybody ever heard of the LA LA Worker Center, LA Black Worker Center?
Of course. Yes. Yes.
Of course, you know, Cheryl. Yeah. So you see this note here, which is that systemic labor discrimination is destroying Black families. While many communities were negatively impacted by the mere onset of the coronavirus pandemic, more than 83% of Black workers in California have filed for unemployment since the pandemic began. 83, that's like only 17 short of 100% of Black workers have filed for unemployment. And even unemployment, I mean, while it's more money than some folks would be making if they were working, it's still not enough. And it's not long lasting. It's not enough. It's not what we need to build our families. It's not what we need to combat the stress that comes from when you don't have enough, when you can't meet your basic needs, you can't care for your family, when you can't dream, right? When it's hard to dream because you don't have the resources. When I say dream, I mean, you know, every time we turn on a TV, we see stuff to buy, right? We used to consume. I say all the time, when you watch TV all day, the one thing you're gonna come away with is you want some Carl's Jr., some McDonald's, some Pizza Hut, and a car. So that's what they're selling you all day long on TV. And those things enter your subconscious, and you want things and you can't get them. It's hard to get them. And so, you know, one way to do that is, you know, my brother sometimes says, you know, got to do what you got to do. And that can lead and sometimes that can lead to violence. And so, yeah. So are there any questions? I'm going to check this chat box right quick. Not for me. Well, someone put, Brad, what is this, Jobs Create Peace on YouTube? Is that a real thing?
It certainly is. We got local hiring of $150 billion on measures from 2016 to 2020. Measure W, measure A, measure M, measure CC, measure H, and measure HHH for local hiring of targeted disadvantage with the construction careers policy implemented through project labor agreements, community benefits agreements, and job coordinators.
So thank you, Brad, because you were helping to make my point again, which is work, jobs, and properly funded education really help to curtail violence in our communities.